The medevac helicopter thundered through the rising light, its rotors beating against the morning air as the desert stretched endlessly below. Harris sat beside Major Hayes, his hand pressed against the stretcher rail to keep her steady, her face pale under the film of dust and smoke, the medic working quietly beside her IV lines, trembling with each jolt of turbulence. She was alive, barely, her breathing shallow but constant, every rise of her chest a small victory. Harris glanced at her then. Out the open door where the battlefield fell away behind them, the twisted canyon fading into the distance, replaced by the flat, endless expanse of sand and silence. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, 30 minutes to base. Harris acknowledged. Without speaking, his mind still trapped in the roar of the A-10, the thunder that had saved them all. At the forward base, medics rushed to meet them, the rotors still spinning as they lifted Hayes out on the stretcher, the smell of burned metal and hydraulic oil following her like a shadow. Harris stepped aside, his gear heavy with grit, his body aching, but his thoughts were fixed on her. The impossible flight, the voice that had never wavered as everything burned. The general arrived moments. Later, his uniform still immaculate, his expression stone hard, he asked if the mission had succeeded. Harris nodded. Yes, sir. The package is secure, but it cost us an A-10. The general looked past him to the medics disappearing into the triage tent and said nothing for a long moment, then turned away, his silence heavier than any reprimand, inside the tent. Hayes drifted between consciousness and the edge of blackout flashes of the canyon burned into her mind, the scream of metal, the fire, the pull, of gravity, and then the sudden quiet, when everything went still. She heard voices around her, muffled and distant, felt hands on her shoulders moving her tubes, tightening, but she could not lift her head. Somewhere nearby, Harris spoke low, telling the doctors what had happened, describing how she had flown through a canyon. No machine should have survived, how she had held the line until the last round was fired. She wanted to tell him to stop, to tell him it was just instinct, not bravery, but the words stayed trapped behind her lips, her body too weak to speak. Outside the tent, the base stirred with the first reports of the mission, success broadcast through the network, the impossible air run already turning into rumor. Soldiers whispered that an A-10 had flown lower than radar itself, that it had defied every order and somehow come back in pieces but alive. The mechanics gathered near the hangars, staring at the black smoke still rising on the horizon from where the wreckage lay. Harris listened without speaking, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew what they were saying. He had seen it too, that impossible flight that had turned disbelief into silence. He turned when the general approached again, his voice low. She is stable. For now, you and your team will debrief in an hour. Harris nodded, but he was not listening. He walked to the flight line where the sand stretched endlessly under the growing heat of the sun, the wind whispering through the wreckage of other missions, the hum of engines still waiting for their next flight. He thought of her words in the canyon told you it could be done, and felt a slow, quiet respect settle over him, a sense that what she had done would not fade with the next report or the next battle. He looked toward the distant haze where the canyon lay unseen but never forgotten, and somewhere in the wind, he thought he heard the echo of engines still roaring through the clouds, as if her A-10 refused to rest, still proving them wrong. The days passed in a blur of reports, debriefs, and the endless hum of the desert wind. Major Hayes remained in the field hospital, her body wrapped in bandages, her mind hovering somewhere between the mission and the quiet beyond. The medics said she was lucky, but Harris knew luck had nothing to do with it. She had survived by will alone, by the same force that had driven her through that canyon when the rest of them had already accepted death. The base moved on as bases always do, new missions. New orders. The wreckage of the A-10 salvaged piece by piece until nothing was left but the scars on the stone and the story whispered in the halls of the pilots who had seen her flight path recorded on radar, an impossible pattern of altitude and speed that defied training and gravity alike. Harris visited her every day, sitting in the folding chair beside her bed as machines beeped in steady rhythm. Sometimes she woke long enough to speak only a few words, her voice faint but clear. He would tell her updates about the team, about how the intel they recovered had exposed an enemy stronghold, about how command was already planning the next strike. She would listen, eyes half open, a faint smile crossing her face when he said the mission had saved lives. When she drifted back into sleep, he would stay a while longer watching the monitors, the rise and fall of her breathing, the faint hum of life that refused to fade, and each time he left, he would glance once more at her medals hanging. From the small table by the bed, outside, the tent, the talk spread through the ranks. They called her the ghost of the canyon, the pilot who flew below radar, the woman who did what no one thought possible. The mechanics rebuilt another A-10 in her name, marking the nose with the call sign she had used Viper 1, her name painted in black beneath the canopy. The sound of its engines during testing echoed across the runway, like a promise, like a memory that would not die. The general stood on the observation deck one morning watching the new bird lift into the sky, its silhouette cutting clean against the dawn. He said nothing, but Harris, standing beside him, caught the faintest trace of a nod, a gesture that meant more than words. Weeks later, Hayes was on her feet again, walking slowly through the medical wing, her steps unsteady but her eyes sharp, the same fire still. There. Harris met her at the gate when she was cleared for duty, the wind carrying dust around them, the sun harsh on the runway. She looked out at the waiting aircraft, the rebuilt A-10 gleaming under the light, and for a long moment said nothing. Then she turned to him and asked, "How low do you think she can fly this time?" He smiled the kind of smile that carried both pride and disbelief and answered, "I think that depends on how much you want to prove them wrong again." She climbed into the cockpit, the movement slow, deliberate, her hands tracing the familiar controls as if greeting an old friend. The ground crew stepped back, engines roaring to life, the air trembling with the sound. Harris stood watching as the A-10 began to roll down the runway, gathering speed, the dust rising in a long golden trail, and then she lifted off, climbing into the endless sky, before banking low again, just above the horizon where the earth and clouds met. She flew straight toward the sun, disappearing into the light, her radio crackling with one final message before the static took over. "Told you no one flies lower," and the sound of her laughter faded into the wind as the desert swallowed the echo of her defiance forever. The smoke rolled thick through the canyon, rising in spirals of heat and ash as the echo of the explosion faded. Major Hayes fought the controls, the A-10 trembling under her hands. Its right wing shredded its hydraulics, screaming the smell of burnt metal filling the cockpit. She had pulled up in time, but barely, the aircraft shaking like a wounded animal, the engines coughing flame. She scanned her instruments, every light flashing red, but her eyes locked on the radar, where the SEALs moved still, alive, still fighting their path toward the extraction zone not yet clear. She gritted her teeth, forcing the stick forward, trying to stabilize the craft. The canyon walls a blur of jagged stone rushing past on either side, her breath steady and shallow, her heart a steady hammer of resolve. Below her, the SEALs were pinned again. Harris, shouting over the comms that they were out of cover, that enemy vehicles were rolling in from the south. Hayes heard him clearly, despite the static she responded in. A calm voice that hid the fire burning in her chest. "Copy that, moving in again." The A-10 dropped low through the dust smoke, streaking across her canopy, her eyes fixed on the shapes ahead, the dark silhouettes of enemy armor glinting through the haze. She armed the remaining rounds, the cannon clicking into place, the weapon system coughing from overuse but still alive. The first burst tore through the dust, a flash of orange and black as one of the vehicles erupted in flame, the recoil shaking. Her entire body, but she held the line, her hands locked steady even as the plane fought her every inch. The canyon narrowed again, the walls closing in like jaws, the sunlight vanishing, the radio crackling with overlapping voices, Harris shouting that they were moving, but the path was blocked, that she had to clear the ridge ahead. Hayes acknowledged, barely breathing as she pitched the nose of the aircraft upward, banking sharply, the right wings screaming in protest. The engines sputtered, one catching, the other fading the controls, sluggish under her grip. But she pushed through the turbulence, cutting close enough to the cliffside that fragments of rock chipped against the fuselage. Sparks danced across the metal surface as she rolled out of the climb and came around again, low and deadly, for another run. She could see them now, the SEALs crawling through the rubble, flashes of gunfire from both sides. Enemy positions dug in deep along the ridgeline. She had one chance to clear them before. Her systems gave out, her fuel almost gone, her hydraulics failing fast. She lined up the shot, the targeting system flickering, refusing to lock, so she went by instinct alone, her finger tightening on the trigger as the cannon spat fire into the cliffs. The noise, a rolling storm that filled the canyon. The rock shattered, explosions rippled through the enemy line, their positions collapsing under the onslaught, the radio filled with shouts, the SEALs breaking through Harris, yelling that they were clear, that she had done it, but her relief was drowned by the sound of the warning siren screaming across the cockpit. Engine failure. The right engine burst into flame, the aircraft jerking violently. She tried to level out, but the stick felt dead. In her hands, smoke filled the cockpit, the heat biting at her skin. She looked through the cracked canopy at the sky above, the faint glow of dawn breaking through the dust. She thought of the words they had said, that no one could fly that low, that no one could make it out alive. She smiled a small, tight smile as she pulled hard on the controls, guiding the crippled A-10 toward the open sky, the ground tilting below, the sound of the engines fading into silence. The last thing she heard was Harris' voice breaking through the static, saying she did it. She really did it before the radio cut out, and the canyon swallowed everything in a haze of smoke and wind. The wreckage lay scattered across the lower ridge, twisted metal, half buried in dust. The heat from the impact still rising in waves through the air. The SEALs moved carefully across the rubble, their faces streaked with sweat and ash, their voices clipped and tense. Harris led the way, rifle raised, eyes scanning for movement, though. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the distant hiss of cooling metal. The A-10 had gone down hard, but not clean. Pieces of its fuselage were scattered across the canyon like fragments of a fallen beast. Harris felt the weight in his chest, the silence heavier than the smoke, the radio dead since the last burst of static. He signaled for his team to spread out to search the wreckage while maintaining cover. The enemy had scattered after the last strike. Her attack had torn through their lines so completely that even the survivors had fled into the rocks, but Harris knew better than to trust the quiet. It was the kind of silence that came before something worse. The team fanned out, weaving through the debris, the smell of burnt fuel, thick enough to sting their eyes. They found one of the wings wedged into the canyon wall, blackened and bent, but no sign of the pilot. The cockpit section was half buried in rock. The canopy shattered, the seat empty. Harris knelt beside it, running, his gloved hand along the torn metal. He had seen enough crashes to know what survival odds looked like, and these were not good. He stared at the ground for a moment, the memory of her voice echoing in his headset. Steady, calm, unbreakable. She had flown that machine, like it was part of her body, had pulled them out of a death trap that no air support should have even reached. He looked up at the team, his expression unreadable. Then he said softly, "Keep searching." She had saved them, once he was not about to leave her behind. The SEALs worked in silence, overturning wreckage, scanning for footprints, signs of movement, anything. The canyon wind picked up, blowing through the smoke, carrying with it the faint metallic creak of cooling steel. Harris followed the sound down a narrow slope where the debris had collected near the edge of a dry riverbed. Something shifted below the wreckage, a faint movement almost too small to notice. He froze, signaling the others, then approached slowly. Rifle ready. The shape moved again. A piece of the fuselage rolled aside, revealing a hand gloved and trembling. He dropped to his knees, clearing debris with rough, hurried motions, until he saw her Major Hayes, her flight suit torn, her face streaked with soot, but her eyes open, barely conscious, barely breathing. He called for a medic, the words breaking through the static of his own disbelief. She was alive somehow. Against every law of physics, she had survived the crash. The medic moved in fast, checking her vitals, while Harris looked up at the sky where smoke still curled from the canyon rim. Above them, the faint thump of helicopter blades echoed through the haze, the extraction team inbound. Harris keyed his radio again, static at first, then a faint reply confirming their position. The SEALs formed a perimeter, weapons ready, as the medic worked over her, stabilizing her for transport. Hayes tried to speak her voice. A whisper, lost in the wind. Harris leaned closer and caught just a few words, low enough that only he could hear. Told you it could be done. Then her eyes closed again, not from defeat, but from exhaustion, and Harris looked back at the broken A-10 that still smoked in the rising light. The chopper descended slowly, kicking up waves of dust, the team loading her stretcher aboard as the sound of rotors drowned out the silence of the canyon. Harris climbed in last, glancing once more at the battlefield below the wreckage. The smoke, the impossible path she had flown, and somewhere deep inside, he knew this was not the end, because something in her eyes, even in that last flicker, had promised more to come. The dawn broke over the desert valley, a thin red line stretching across the horizon as the SEALs prepared for insertion, the dust clinging to their gear and the silence heavy around them. Major Alexandra Hayes stood by her A-10 Thunderbolt the engines, humming softly as the desert wind swept across the airfield, the heat already rising like a warning. She had been told the mission parameters twice, once by the briefing officer and again by the general himself. The SEALs would move through a narrow canyon to extract an intelligence asset while her job was to provide cover fire from the air. But there was a catch. The canyon walls were too high for normal flight paths, and the SEALs had muttered that no pilot could fly that low, not with that much enemy presence and not with that kind of machine. The A-10 was built for ground attack, but not for threading through stone corridors barely wider than its wings. Hayes listened quietly, her gloved hand resting on the cold metal of her plane, every word echoing like a challenge waiting to be answered. And as the general gave his final nod, she caught the look from one of the SEALs, half grin, half doubt. That look stayed with her as she climbed into the cockpit. The engines thundered to life, the roar, breaking the stillness of the morning, her canopy reflecting the first sharp rays of light. The ground crew scattered back, giving her the thumbs up as the radio crackled in her ear, confirming the mission clock was live. The SEALs moved, out in their convoy below, heading toward the canyon, while she taxied down the runway, pushing the throttle forward, the twin engines screaming as the A-10 leapt into the sky, the dust trailing behind like a comet tail. She could feel the vibration. Through her bones, the hum of the machine like a heartbeat that matched her own. She leveled off low, flying just above the sand, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead. Every ridge and dune burned into her memory from the maps she had studied all night. The radio was quiet except for short bursts of updates from ground command, but beneath that quiet she felt the pulse of anticipation, the weight of what was coming. The SEALs were moving through hostile territory, the enemy entrenched in the cliffs, above the canyon, and she was their only cover. She adjusted her altitude lower and lower each descent, bringing her closer to the jagged stone edges that reached for her wings. The first hint of contact came like a whisper, static breaking across. Her headset followed by the clipped voice of the SEAL team leader. Contact left 2:00. She banked hard to starboard, the G-force pressing against her chest as she descended further, the canyon opening like the jaws of a trap below her. The rocks blurred past her canopy so close she could almost touch them, the A-10's engines howling as she dropped into the valley floor. The enemy fire lit the cliffs in flashes of orange tracer rounds cutting through the air. She adjusted the throttle steady, her fingers dancing across the weapons panel, locking targets as her training took over. The world became motion and sound, the rattle of the GAU-8 cannon bursting to life, tearing through enemy emplacements like thunder rolling across the valley. Floor below. The SEALs moved under her shadow, their position illuminated by the explosions above the radio, alive with their clipped calls for movement and support. Her focus narrowed the canyon, tightening around her, each turn sharper than the last. The rock walls closing in like a fist, but she held steady, every reflex honed through years of flying. The heat shimmered across the cockpit glass. Sweat trickled down her temple as she pulled into another dive, the altimeter dropping so fast it felt like free fall. The radio screamed another call-out, multiple positions on the ridge. She responded with steel and fire, the cannon roaring again, the recoil shaking the aircraft, her vision blurring from the vibration, but she held her course, hugging. The canyon wall so close, the wingtips brushed the dust from the stone. The SEALs below moved in rhythm with her strikes, their path carved open by each burst of firepower. She could hear their leader over the comms shouting, "Move, move, move," his voice, raw but alive. The A-10 roared again, the echo bouncing off the cliffs as she climbed slightly to avoid a protruding ledge. The sky vanishing above, replaced by shadow and smoke. Then came the warning light blinking red on her console, a heat signature, spiking from the cliffs to her left. She twisted hard, banking with every ounce of strength, the missile streaking past her right wing, the explosion rattling the air around her. She caught her breath, the shockwave rocking the plane, the alarms screaming in her headset, but she steadied the stick and dropped lower again below the enemy's line of sight, dust and debris swirling in her wake. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm over the radio. Target neutralized. Continue movement. The SEALs acknowledged their tone, quick-clipped all business. But beneath it, she could hear the disbelief, the realization that she was still there, still flying lower than anyone had thought possible. She guided the A-10 through another turn, the light dimming. As the canyon narrowed, her fuel running, lean, her systems running hot, but she pressed on the extraction point still miles ahead. The SEALs were moving fast, but the enemy was regrouping, setting up at the far end of the canyon where the walls curved sharply into an ambush. She could see it forming on her radar dots, blooming like a storm waiting to break. She had one pass left, one chance to clear the path before the SEALs walked into it. She exhaled once, steady and cold, her eyes fixed on the narrow curve of rock ahead as she dropped altitude once more, her engines roaring, the dust exploding beneath her wings. And as she pulled the trigger, unleashing another burst of fire into the canyon ahead, the world lit up in flame and fury, and the radio went silent, leaving only the echo of her engines and the waiting silence that followed. The air rippled with the shockwave from the last strike, dust and heat swirling through the canyon as Major Hayes steadied the stick, the A-10 groaning under. The strain of low-altitude maneuvers, her breathing sharp through the mask, her heart hammering against her ribs. Below her, the SEALs pushed forward, their dark figures moving like shadows through the smoke, their voices sharp bursts of sound across. The comms she could barely hear over the roar of her engines. The canyon twisted ahead, narrowing again, the walls high enough to block radar and light the path, a knife edge of stone and danger. She checked her instruments, the fuel gauge low, the Warning lights flickering, but she ignored them because the team below still needed her, and they were far from clear. A voice cracked through the radio. "Harris, the SEAL leader, we are pinned at the bend. Hostiles above both sides. We cannot move Hayes." Banked hard, the G-force crushing her into the seat as the A-10 tilted sideways, scraping air so close to the rock that sparks flew from her wingtips. The targeting system locked. She fired again. The GAU-8 spitting fire and thunder, the vibration shaking every bolt in the cockpit. The rounds tore into the ridge, shredding the enemy positions above the SEALs as fragments of rock and steel rained down in an avalanche of noise and chaos. Harris shouted over the channel, "Target destroyed, moving now," but she could hear the urgency behind his voice, and she knew it was only getting worse. Smoke filled the canyon thicker now, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Hayes adjusted her altitude lower than safety allowed her instincts, taking control as she flew by, feel alone, reading the subtle shifts of air pressure, the rhythm of the canyon itself. The alarms blared in her headset, heat warning systems overload, but her focus stayed fixed on the radar where new signatures appeared at the far end of the valley, more enemy vehicles moving into position. They were trying to trap the SEALs inside, and she was the only thing standing in their way. She switched to the secondary weapon system, her thumb hovering over the release she lined up the run perfectly in her mind before diving again. The A-10 screamed through the narrow gap, the engines tearing at the air as she unleashed the payload explosions rolling across the canyon floor in waves of light and fury. Her vision blurred from the recoil, her body pressed hard against the seat. Yet she held the course steady until the last moment, pulling up barely in time to avoid a collision with the rising cliff. The radio erupted with voices, Harris shouting that they were clear, but she caught another tone beneath it. Something else, fear maybe, or disbelief that she had survived the run. The A-10 leveled out, low smoke curling around its wings like ghost trails as she circled back over the canyon, scanning for any sign of movement. Her fuel was dangerously low, systems flickering, warning after warning, the aircraft wounded from the stress. But she refused to climb out. She could not leave them yet. The SEALs had reached the extraction zone, but enemy reinforcements were closing fast, the radar lighting up again with new threats. She descended once more, despite every indicator screaming for her to abort. Her eyes locked on the shapes below, the only thing that mattered now. Her hand tightened on the controls as the canyon opened into a final wide basin where dust and chaos merged into one. She lined up for one last strafing run, the engines howling the metal of the plane, trembling as if it understood the risk she was about to take. As she dove, the sun broke through the haze, casting long streaks of light across the wreckage and smoke. She could see the SEALs moving toward the waiting helicopter, but beyond them came the flash of hostile fire. She adjusted her aim one last time, the world narrowing to a tunnel of motion. Sound and willpower, her finger tightening on the trigger as the earth rose to meet her, and then everything vanished in a wall of flame and thunder, leaving only silence and the fading echo of her engine still.